to bring the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and think about it in this particular way. If I may present a few points here about critical studies of Hadith content. And that has to do with the content of the Hadith in relation to the Quran. So as we reflect on the Quran, and I will give examples of 3 topics, we should bring these topics from the Quran to be hegemonic over the same topics in the Hadith. I'm going to close this program so it doesn't cause issues. So basically, the issues of politics, the issues of women and Islam, and what is known as the Israeliyat or the Israelites narrations. These 3 topics had impacted the narration of Hadith in a part of it. Of course, many parts of Hadith have nothing to do with the political factor, and nor women nor the Israelite narrations. But these 3 areas have a special sensitivity when it comes to the Hadith versus the Quran. Because sometimes you have a Hadith that really contradicts with what the Quran is saying about these particular issues, about some of the political issues, some of the issues related to women, and in the people of the book or the children of Israel narrations. The impact of politics appears a lot in a number of ways, especially the obedience of the rulers, kind of the fiqh of obedience, what I write about and I call al-fiqh al-ta'a, the fiqh of obedience. What is this fiqh, and how can we reconcile what we have in the Quran? And we have in the Quran a lot about obedience to the Prophet, and even obedience to people in charge. But how can we reconcile what's in the Quran with some of the ahadith that do not seem to drive with that part? How can we, from the reflection on the Quran, go to the reflection on the Sunnah and correct some of these understandings of the hadith, as well as the issue of women and Islam. And the narrations of hadith happened in a time when some of the narrators were not totally, let's say, changed, did not change enough to represent how the Quran deals with women. And they ended up narrating the ahadith in a way that did not really represent that picture in the Quran. So we will see how come. I'll give some examples, as well as the impact of the Israelites narrations, especially on those 2 issues, the issue of women especially, and the people of the book. Some of the stuff that they changed in their books have a lot to do with women, and some of the harsh opinions that we could have in some of the narrations are actually coming from their books, not from Islam, and I will demonstrate that in a couple of ways. We start with a simple hadith that is there in Bukhari and Muslim about the shum or bad omens. Couldn't translate all of the hadith, but I will translate as I speak, inshallah. So when he sallallahu alayhi wasallam said that bad omens are in your horse, in your woman, and in your house. Basically, if something happens to you, you go and you blame your wife because she brings a bad omen. When Aisha radiallahu anha, and this is something that some of our scholars had written whole books about, it's called Aisha's Amendments of the Companions' Narrations, that she radiallahu anha sometimes goes and corrects some of the narrations and says that no, they didn't understand exactly. So when Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu narrated that bad omens are in your horse and in your mount and in your house, Aisha, 2 people came to her and told her, well, Abu Huraira is narrating, and Abdullah ibn Umar too, that radiallahu anhum jami'an, that the bad omens are in your wife, in your house, or in your mount. So she said, by Allah, this was not the narration. This is not what happened. What happened is that he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was saying that people before Islam used to say that. And some of the people who entered the room heard the last part of the hadith, but they did not hear the first part. But more importantly, look at what she is saying here in order to correct the narration. She said, قال تعالى ما أصاب مصيبة في الأرض ولا في أنفسكم إلا في كتاب من قبل أن نبرأها. She read from the Quran in order to correct the narration or the understanding or the misunderstanding rather of the narration. So she went to the Quran and said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, there is no calamity that appears on earth or in yourselves, except that is something that is written in a book with Allah Almighty before He subhanahu wa ta'ala creates it. So basically, whatever comes to me is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordained, and it is because of something that I do. ما أصابك من سيئة فمن نفسك. When something happens to you, it's because of you, the Quran is saying. And therefore she is correcting, radiallahu anha, Aisha is correcting that narration based on a reflection on the Quran, that it's not because of my wife that I lost my job or lost whatever. It's because of what we as a community would do. It's because the economic system needs to be fixed, or it's because of a natural, let's say, disaster that happened, or because of many other things, but not because of the bad omens of I go and blame my wife or go and blame my horse or any of that. So Aisha here, radiallahu anha, and she has a number of those, which I'll show you some examples, is correcting the narration of the hadith with the reflection upon the Quran. Look at this other narration. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu narrated that he thought that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, or he heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Al-mayyitu yu'adhabu bi-buka'i al-hayy, wa walad az-zina sharru thalatha." He is saying that when somebody dies and his family cries and screams, Allah will punish him for the screaming of his family. That's one. And the other narration, he is saying that two people committed adultery and they have a child. The child is worse than his parents. The child is worse than his parents. And unfortunately, this had impacted fiqh and had impacted some of the opinions, this narration that is narrated by authentic people, but it is misheard, it is misunderstood. And Aisha corrected that by going back again to the Quran. She is saying, Allah said in the Quran, subhanahu wa ta'ala, لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى. No soul should carry the burden of another soul. So Allah forbid, two people commit adultery and they have a child. That child has no blame in that. He should not carry the sin of his parents. He is a child who is born as on the innate nature, on the fitrah, on Islam, and then grows up to be a Muslim. Why would the child, a girl or a boy, carry the burden of the parents? Allah didn't say that. And then he said, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah does not account a soul except for what it can take. So Allah accounts me because of what He can ask of me, what He asks of me, subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of what I do. But if my parents do something, I should not carry their burden. That carry of the burden and inheritance of the burden is from other religions. Yes, they have, the original sin and the original burden and all of that. We don't have that in Islam, because in Islam, every person carries their own deeds, not other people's deeds. Therefore, she corrected. And then she said, no, it wasn't like that. One of the hypocrites was saying harmful things about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he said, "Man ya'dhuruni min fulan?" Who could speak to him so he could stop all of this hurtful stuff that he is saying about me, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they told him, he is a son of adultery. On top of what he says about you, he said, "Huwa sharru thalatha." He said he is worse than his parents. So he didn't mean that every son of adultery is worse than his parents. He is saying that this person, particular person, he was hurting the Prophet ﷺ with what he says. And this is a bigger sin than adultery that his parents did. So that's why he said, Huwa sharru thalath. Aisha here is correcting the narration because she heard it. She was the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, and the Quran is saying, وَاذْكُرْنَا مَا يُتْلَى فِي بُيُوتِكُنَّ مِنْ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ وَالْحِكْمَةِ. Here is another reflection that the Quran is telling the mothers of the believers, remember what you hear at home from the book of Allah and the wisdom that you hear from the Prophet ﷺ. And yes, Aisha was one of the narrators of the Quran, and Salama and others of his wife ﷺ. They narrated the Quran that we have and eventually written in the Mus'haf, in the book. And they also narrated Hadith. Her narration is strong and is authentic, and she is a knowledgeable person in her own right. So she said, no, it wasn't like that. It was about that person who was worse than his parents, who committed adultery because he was hurting the Prophet ﷺ. And it was not that the man is going to be tortured because of his family's crying. He is actually tortured because of what he did. And she is saying, there was a man in Medina, he died. So he and his family were screaming and wailing. So the Prophet ﷺ said, they were screaming and wailing, and he is facing his bad deeds, and he's being punished for his bad deeds. So he is not saying that he is punished because of their screaming and wailing. He is punished because of his bad deeds, and they are carrying their own burden by the screaming and the stuff that is not supposed to be happening in Islam. So she corrected here based on reflecting upon the Quran. And that principle in the Quran, لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى, no soul should carry a burden of another soul, is very important in our concept of justice and mercy and so forth. We don't have collective punishment in Islam. This is not something that we humans do. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does that, subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's a different kind of punishment when he sends a collective punishment. And those who are good is considered a shahada for them, and those who are evil is considered something like part of their punishment. So if he sends a flood or sends a natural disaster, he's not punishing everybody, subhanahu wa ta'ala. For some people, it's a shahada, it's martyrdom, it's a trial, like the trial we have these days with the COVID-19. And some people, it's not a trial, it's actually a punishment. So it's not the same for everybody. So she is saying no soul should carry a burden of another soul. Every person is responsible for him or herself. When they narrated that the Prophet ﷺ was talking to the people after the battle, she said, I have to plug my computer. I'm sorry. Just give me a few seconds. Allah, forgive me for that. So she was saying that how can they narrate that the Prophet ﷺ was speaking to the people in their graves after the battle, I think, of Badr. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَنْ فِي الْقُبُورِ. You cannot make people who in their graves hear you. This is something in the Quran. Another narration, how can they narrate that the Prophet ﷺ saw Allah on the day of Isra and Mi'raj? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, لا تدركه الأبصار. Nobody could see him, subhanahu wa ta'ala, at least in the human form, in the life that we are in. When they narrated some narrations that allowed what some of the opinions say, temporary marriage, she said, no, this is not a form of marriage in Islam. بيني وبينكم كتاب الله. Read the book of Allah and you know the truth about it. And then she read, إلا على أزواجهم أو ما ملكت أيمانهم. They are not allowed except their wives. And she is saying this is not a wife. A wife who is a temporary wife is not something that's Islamic. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu said the same thing. And therefore, she corrected that interpretation. And this happened in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ as a stage the Prophet ﷺ took the companions in stages of prohibiting al-khamr or intoxicants, liquor, of prohibiting zina, adultery. All of these things were rampant in their societies, and he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, took them in stages. But there is nothing in Islam that allows the drinking of alcohol or intoxicants, and there's nothing in Islam that allows a temporary relationship. Marriage is for good in Islam. Yes, we have the system of divorce, but that's a different story, not from the beginning like that. And then another narration in which one of the companions narrated that she was divorced, and then she got nothing from her husband, and she lived in a different house and so on. So she told her no, and Umar radiallahu anhu also said that, and Usama and Jabir and others, they said no. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said differently, said that there is a nafaqah for her and so on. And that particular case, she was somebody who lived outside Medina in the desert. So the Prophet ﷺ was concerned for her safety, Aisha said. So he moved her to a different house, and he changed the way she is going to be supported based on that. In other words, she is differentiating between a special case and the general case that the Quran is going to cover. Talking about halal food, when they said that the Prophet ﷺ did not allow them to eat horse meat in one of the battles, she said, no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran said, قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِيمَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا عَلَى طَاعِمٍ يَطْعَمُهُ إِلَّا أَن يَكُونَ مَيْتَةً أَوْ دَمًا مَسْفُوحًا أَوْ لَحْمَ خِنْزِيرٍ. She said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran said, there is nothing that I find in the scripts that is not allowing somebody to eat something except for a dead animal or blood or pork. And then she said, no, it was a battle, and he did not want them to slaughter their donkeys or their horses because they needed them for the battle. And it's not because this meat is haram, and so forth. So she, radiallahu anha, well, some hadith, also another hadith in which the majority of the dwellers of hell are women and so on. And she said, no, it's not about that. There was a woman, the woman who was tortured because she killed her cat, basically, and so forth. So she defended that this is a different hadith. This is not about every woman in every time and the female companions, as if the Prophet ﷺ is telling them, the majority of you are going to hell. This is not what he said. She's saying it's about somebody who was a disbeliever. And in addition to her disbelief, she tortured her cats. So these are some examples of Aisha radiallahu anha correcting some hadith about women and about other matters in which the hadith is not narrated correctly. And it has a particular bias against a child of adultery, a cultural bias. But we don't have that bias in Islam. Against women that, majority of them are going to hell. And these kinds of biases that people do not understand, or narrator after narrator, they take hadith away from the correct, proper conveyance of the hadith. How do we know? By referring to the Quran. And this is the methodology of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. I mentioned the number of names, not Aisha only, despite the fact that Aisha was very distinct in that particular correction of the narrations. Umar and Jabir and Ibn Abbas and many others, when they hear something, somebody is saying that the Prophet ﷺ said something and the Quran is against it, he says, no, this is not how it is, because the Quran, this and that. And they go back and question, how come the narration went wrong? Not because the Prophet ﷺ would say anything against the Quran. He was a Quran walking on earth, as she said, but how the narrators sometimes are inaccurate. The issue of obeying the rules, if we go to the Quran, you will find many mentions of obedience. Some obedience people will be punished for. The obedience is when it is said in the hereafter that they will tell their masters and their kings, we obeyed you, but you led us astray, and we obeyed you and you made us do injustices and so forth. So they basically repent at a time when repentance would not be accepted anymore in the hereafter, about obeying tyrants and obeying unjust rulers. So obedience in that particular sense is not a blind obedience. It is an obedience for something that is positive. That's something that does not contradict with Islam, something that's not injustice. ولا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل وتدلوا بها إلى الحكام لتأكلوا فريقا من أموال الناس. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, do not embezzle the public wealth and give it to the rulers. So if the ruler is asking you to embezzle public wealth or to give him something from the public property and so on, Allah is saying, do not do that, because this is not obedience. This is haram. But also, He subhanahu wa ta'ala is also asking us to obey those who are in charge, and to obey your parents, and to obey, your elderly, and so forth. This is part of Islam too. But there is a condition here, that this obedience is not supposed to lead to something wrong, or lead to a harm to your family, let's say, and so forth. And we know that from Abu Bakr and Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, and all of the companions and the followers who were understanding the issue properly. Abu Bakr said, if I do something right, then help me. If I do something wrong, then correct me. And Umar said, if you see me going crooked, correct me, even with your swords. He's telling them. And Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, he's saying, if I obey Allah, then obey me. And if I disobey Allah, then you have no obedience to give me. And so forth. And that is very important in the correction of that. So Ubadah ibn Samit had a debate with Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, when Muawiyah was a ruler of Syria at that time. And Ubadah insisted on advising Muawiyah. Muawiyah told him, well, you have to obey me. I'm the prince. Ubadah told him, no, I heard the Prophet ﷺ saying, لا طاعة لمن عصى الله تبارك وتعالى. If you do something wrong, I give you no obedience, because then you would be somebody who is a sinner. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, in addition to Ubadah ibn Samit, is narrating something even more serious. He is saying, Prophet ﷺ asked us to be good to our rulers, but if they do not follow my example, he said, ﷺ, and if they are going to kill the people and embezzle their money, then فمن جاهدهم بيده فهو مؤمن ومن جاهدهم بلسانه فهو مؤمن ومن جاهدهم بقلبه فهو مؤمن. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said, the Prophet told me, if you can do jihad against them with your arm, then do. And if you can do jihad against them with your tongue, then do. And if not, then do jihad against them with your heart. And this is the weakest of Iman. Abdullah ibn Abbas is saying, there will be princes. The Prophet ﷺ told me, there will be princes who do wrong things. So if you push them away from doing the wrong things, you will survive. And if you mix with them, you will perish, and so forth. So now we are correcting here an understanding of some of the narrations that go half narration, because we hear so many of these narrations. I come from the Arab world. This is so rampant in the Arab world. Every time you try to correct something in the public sense, they tell you, well, no, you have to obey the leaders. No, you have to obey the leaders if they're good, and if they order you to do something good, not if they are tyrants. Then we have to correct them. And in fact, the Prophet ﷺ is asking us to try to change the status quo as much as possible. I want to skip a few steps to the issue of the impact of the Israelite narration, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, finally, this is the point here, finally, that He said subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ كِتَابَ الْحَقِّ مُصَدِّقًا لِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ وَمُهَيْمِنًا عَلَيْهِ. Allah sent the Quran as hegemonic over the previous books. Why? Because the previous books were from Allah, but they were narrated by people, and the narrations have changed over time. And that hegemony of the Quran over the other narrations include what they say that they have in the previous book. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying here that they have altered some of their books and so forth. So be careful with that. The Prophet ﷺ also said, be careful with what you hear from the people of the book, because they have changed some of the detail. Therefore, here you have sometimes a narration that doesn't go with the Quran. And part of the reflection on the Quran is to reject this narration. There is a clear narration here that goes against the Quran in Sahih Muslim and Musnad Ahmad by Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, when he narrated that the narration goes, the Prophet ﷺ took my hand, he said, Allah created the soil on Saturday, the mountains on Sunday, the trees on Monday, etc., all the way until Friday, and then he created Adam. So basically he created everything in 7 days. And that narration goes against the Quran. If you go to Surah Fussilat, you will see that Allah created everything in 6 days, 2 and 2 and 2. And that's why Bukhari radiallahu anhu, and others, they said, how can Muslim narrate that? And it goes against the Quran, because Allah created the heavens and earth in 6 days, not 7. And the 7 days thing, I mean, yes, it's missing the Saturday rest, which would be the rest of the narration from their books, but it is actually showing us that the Imams of Islam, like Imam Bukhari, is correcting the other Imams of Islam, like Imam Muslim, when they narrate something that goes against the Quran. And if you read Surah Fussilat, the first 10, 15 verses, has a very different account of the creation from this hadith. When Allah, also the hadith that if Hawa or Eve did not betray her husband, no woman would have ever betrayed her husband. And that is right from the people of the books narrations. This is not in Islam. In Islam, in the Quran, it is Adam who actually, وَعَصَى آدَمُ رَبَّهُ فَغَوَى. It is Adam who made the sin, not Eve. And there is no snake, and there is no apple, and there is none of this. It is Adam that the shaitan came to him and told him, why don't you eat from the tree? And his wife obviously followed him. That is the Quran. But they are talking about her betraying him, and that's why women betray their husbands. And this is not right. And that's why other scholars had corrected these narrations. So I want to stop here. I just wanted to give examples and make the point, perhaps, that part of the narration of the Quran, part of the reflection of the Quran that we should do is actually to think about the narrations of Hadith in light of the Quran. And obviously, as I showed, this is a bit of a specialized issue, but it's important for the Muslim public to know that not anybody who comes and tells you, oh, there is a hadith that says this, that this is absolute truth, because it depends on the narration. It depends on whether there are narrations in the hadith or ayat in the Quran that go against that. And of course, this would be a matter of asking other scholars or matter of doing research. If you are somebody who is scholarly enough to do this research, I thought that this would be a topic in the reflection on the Quran that shows you how important that reflection is. Well, Jazakumullah khair, barakallahu feekum. I'm looking forward to the questions. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah khair, Professor Jasser. Thank you for today's lecture. I actually appreciate the twist in today's lecture. So we'll go straight into the questions. The first question, so we're going to attend to the first three questions will be the questions from the last time. If you have questions, please send it to the chat or send it to me privately. The first question, Assalamu alaikum, what are your thoughts on Islam and feminism, especially how feminism is being propagated today?
Well, yeah, when we have a terminology that is not coming from Islam, we have to critique that terminology. And it is very important not to reject the whole terminology or accept the whole terminology. Like we have feminism, we have democracy, we have whatever, human rights, rule of law, this kind of thing, terrorism, whatever it is, that is a term that is not an Islamic term. It's important to apply our critical thought. Some of the feminist concerns are very important and are actually things that Islam 1,400 years ago had started in the world. Muhammad is the first human being who said that men and women are equal. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Nobody had ever said that in any philosophy or any interpretation of religion before him. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And so if you mean by feminism, the equality in the basic dignity, obviously, and in the basic, not in the rights and responsibilities. These are different. Mothers are closer to their babies, for example. They have more rights to them than men. Doesn't mean that you discriminate against men, but it means that they are naturally are capable of taking care of their children more than men, and so forth. So I'm not talking about rights and responsibilities, but equal dignity and so forth. If feminists are calling for equal pay for equal jobs, or calling for education for girls, or calling for the issue of violence, which is actually rampant because of this COVID-19. Men cannot control themselves at their homes and are beating their wives everywhere. In the West here, we have murder in Europe and in America and in Canada too, where I live. We have murders because of the COVID-19 and men going crazy and so forth. If feminists are against that, then Islam supports that. But sometimes they go beyond a certain red line in Islam, and they ask for things that go against the Islamic teachings. Some of the Arab feminists are calling for, the right for prostitution, without mentioning names of some of the Arab thinkers. That is not, prostitution is not a right. Prostitution is haram and should be illegal. So when they go beyond a certain line and they ask for things that go against what is fixed and known and ended, a long time ago in Islam, then we are supposed to reject that. So it's not black or white, but we have to know what they are talking about.
Okay, next question. What is the position of the Quran on women taking up leadership roles in the society?
Actually, the Quran is very positive about that. The Quran gave a few good examples of leaders. One of them, and a prime example, is the Queen of Sheba. And therefore, she was a leader and she made shura and she was a queen and so forth. We have the other example in Surah Al-Baqarah of a good leader of Talut, who was a king, a good king. And the rest of the leaders in the Quran, except for the prophets, obviously, were corrupt. So we have a very good example of a great leader in the Quran. Some of the scholars say, no, she was a leader because this is from the jurisprudence of people before us, shar'u man qablana. This was Sharia before us, but Islam came and abrogated that. And that's not true. No, this is not true. There is nothing in Islam that does not allow a woman to be a leader. And even in the fiqh, when they discussed that, they were talking about the khilafah al-Muslimin, not a leader of a school or a union, student union. Wherever I go in universities, and they elect a sister for a student union leader, the brothers, the kids there give her a hard time. And I saw this everywhere, including recently in South Africa, in Cape Town, and University of Cape Town. They gave the sisters a hard time because they won the elections in the student election. I told them, this is not a khilafah here. MSA Cape Town is not a khilafah. So if you have a leader who is a woman, nobody ever in our Islamic scholarship has objected to that. But more importantly, the Quran is actually giving an example with a number of women. Maryam, radiallahu anha, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and the mother of Musa and all of that, and the Queen of Sheba. They are great leaders. And we have in the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam leaders. They fought with him in battles. And they ended up sometimes leading battles with him. Khawla bint al-Azwar, eventually, obviously, not with him at the time of Khalid, radiallahu anhu. He made her lead a whole battalion of Muslims. And they led the market, and they led, and so forth. So I have no issues with women leaders in Islam, by no means. And this is my understanding of the Quran in its clear expressions.
Thank you. If you have questions, please send them privately or send them through the chat. For those on IG, please send a direct message. The next question, can non-Muslims carry the Quran?
Yes, of course. How can they read it if they don't carry it, if they don't touch it? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran is asking them to read it. I'm flabbergasted by this question, which I hear everywhere. Allahu Akbar. How can Allah is saying, Ya ayyuhan nas, people, look at this book and reflect upon it and compare its verses and see if Muhammad is saying anything that goes against your minds and against your intellect, hundreds of verses. How can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ask them to read it and they cannot touch it? So they're supposed to read it like from a distance. What silly idea is this? How can they read it if they cannot touch it and if they cannot carry it? But if they carry it in a way that puts down the Quran in any sense or insults Islam in any sense, oh, that's a different story. If you're talking about them using the Quran, reading it or carrying it or even putting it on a wall or whatever, in a way that that insults Islam, no, that's an act of aggression against Islam, against the community. But if they carry it in order to read it, that's exactly what Allah is asking them to do. How can they become Muslim if they don't read it? Subhanallah. And then you ask them to become Muslim and then be able to read the Quran. How can? But the Quran is the way of them reading it to start to, to become Muslim. Allah, yeah.
What's the fiqh position on inheritance by a child out of wedlock?
Well, scholars have different opinions about it, but if you're asking about my opinion, I believe that that child is a normal child that should inherit and should have all the rights. Based on that interpretation of Aisha radiallahu anha that I showed you, that لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى. He should not carry the burden of another person. If he has a father, of course, obviously, if there is doubt in his relation to his father, the relation to the mother, usually there's no doubt about it because he came out of his mother, unless there is a dispute over mothers or whatever. But if there is a doubt, that's a different story. That's a criminal case that has to be dealt with properly. And I believe in DNA testing in these kinds of cases. I take this modern fatwa, contemporary fatwa given by a number of scholars, in order to prove, especially if the father is going to deny something. But if it is his father, I believe that he inherits him and he inherits his mother because he should not be disadvantaged because of the sin. This is a minority opinion, I know, but it's the opinion that I believe is coherent with the Quran. And the majority opinion, I think, is unfair to that child. That the child doesn't inherit, the child doesn't lead prayers. Why? If he reads the Quran and he is a good kid, why do we give him a disadvantage because of his parents? That is not Islamic. And the hadith actually that talks about that, I showed you, and I showed you Aisha radiallahu anha herself, is against it. So if you tell me, oh no, but Ibn Umar said, well, but Aisha said, Aisha is a Sahabi too. And she's actually closer to the Prophet than all of the other companions. If we're going to get into that comparison. Of course, all the companions are great people who conveyed the message of the Prophet ﷺ. But some companions, I'm sorry, are more fuqaha than others. And therefore, Aisha, yes, can she correct Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhuma? Yes, she can. And I think she has more knowledge than him as somebody who does Islamic scholarship. So when I have her opinion, and especially related on the Quran and tied to the Quranic verses, and I have Abu Hurairah's narration, radiallahu anhu, I would say that her narration is stronger. And we have to really take one and leave the other. I'm sorry, this is not, we cannot reconcile this. We have, like some of the contradictions in narrations can be reconciled by saying, oh, he said this in the summer, he said this in the winter, this was a time of war, this was a time of peace. But this particular hadith in which whether the son of adultery is somebody that has a problem and he is evil and stuff, or the son of adultery has no burden. And I believe that him or her having no burden is closer to the Quran.
Okay. How do we make the Quran more accessible, especially to the non-Muslims, to understand the message of Islam?
Well, to look for translations that are balanced and are reasonable. Well, of course, if they know Arabic, of course, they just read the Arabic, and if they have questions, and Arabic is a language that's not difficult to learn. I have met a number of non-Muslims in Europe and America and in Asia. In Africa, the number is much less, who learned Arabic, the Arabic language, and are able to actually speak the language and read the Quran for themselves. If they cannot, then we should look for a good translation if they're going to read, let's say, in English or in other language, or perhaps depending on their level of knowledge. Not everybody could take a thick book like the Quran and read the whole thing and have the complexity. If they are simple, then we start with the simplest of messages, which is Allah is one and Muhammad is his messenger. This is what Allah's Prophet ﷺ did in his da'wah. So he started with the very basic unity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then what Islam is asking us to do in terms of basic character, etc. If they are simple people. But if they're more intellectual, we should give them a good translation to read and reflect upon it.
Okay. What is your stand on praying with social distancing, giving spacing during congregational prayer?
Wallahi, that is a complex issue. I think I give the opinion usually that praying jama'ah with distances, like people are dispersed in the mosque like that, is not helpful. Because number one, it doesn't stop the infection, like in our particular case, and with sorry, people I think have to turn off their mic. In our particular case, and with COVID-19, sorry. In our particular case and with COVID-19, it's not helpful because if somebody is infected, Allah forbid, the carpets will be infected, everything. But I believe that if the threat becomes less, perhaps if every person has their own mat, prayer mat, and they have a mask, then perhaps we would minimize the infection as much as possible. But to pray jama'ah with people dispersed around the masjid, I don't think that this is the form that the jama'ah should be prayed in. Allahu A'lam. Especially the required prayers. If it is nafil prayers or tatawwa, what's called optional prayers, then yeah, we could pray at home, we could pray online. The nafil prayer, in my opinion, has much less restrictions. And that is what I know from fiqh, from the required Jum'ah. So we cannot pray Jum'ah dispersed like that. But if we can pray Taraweeh, let's say, and we follow an online person or through the radio, yeah, a number of scholars gave opinions to allow that, including myself.
There are narrations attributed to Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu that obviously are not consistent with Aqidah, Islam, and you just gave an example. Going by the very stringent requirements for accepting the words of an Hadith narrator, how do we relate with narrations from Abu Hurairah?
Well, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu is a great companion who had a fantastic memory, and that's why he narrated so much about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I do not believe that the problem is in Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. I think the problem is in the chain of narrators. And if I may show you if I can find it. I cannot find my, I have one of those slides about one of the narrators who said that Abu Hurairah would tell us about the Prophet ﷺ and would tell us about what the people of the book have, because he was friends with Ka'b al-Ahbar, one of the rabbis who converted to Islam and narrated a lot of things. So he would tell them about the Prophet ﷺ, and he would tell them also about what the Jews of Medina used to say and their books and so forth. And then he is saying that some of the narrators in latter generations would mix between what Abu Hurairah said and what Ka'b al-Ahbar said. So be careful with that. So that is a witness of one of the narrators that the people who are next in the chain might have mixed what Abu Hurairah anhu is saying with what Ka'b al-Ahbar is saying. Whether Ka'b al-Ahbar was a hypocrite or not, scholars differed over that. I don't know. I cannot really get into people's hearts from that distance in history to know whether they're hypocrites or not. But I know that the people of the book have changed a lot of things. The Quran is telling us. And that's why if there is a narration from them about their books, like Ka'b al-Ahbar and Wahb and all of these, then we should not take them for granted. And I think that's part of the reason of what happened in Abu Hurairah's narrations, radiallahu anhu. But if you want to take the opinion of some people, especially in the Shia school, where they totally reject Abu Hurairah and reject, you will have nothing left from the Sunnah, because he narrated almost half of it, half of what we know about the Prophet ﷺ, including the other hadith that were authenticated by many other narrators, you see. So you know that he is accurate and he is correct, because what he is saying is exactly like what Umar said and Abu Bakr and Ali radiallahu anhum and so forth. And therefore, you really cannot take Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu as black and white, as some scholars suggest. I disagree with that. I think he's a great companion, but I think we need to investigate exactly, because he narrated so much, we need to investigate it so much, where he got the narration from, or where the next generations got the narration from.
So the second question from the person who asked the question. Secondly, there are similarly such hadith in Sahih Bukhari that are against some higher of the Quran. Yet many do things quite profound simply because it was reported in Bukhari or Muslim. Should these books be treated like deputy Quran, in quotes?
I don't know, deputy Quran, I've never heard this deputy Quran terminology. But I could tell you that no, there is nothing that's equal to the Quran. But of course, it's a source. Both books, Bukhari and Muslim, are a great source, or the great source. Actually, about 70% of the hadith that we have about the Prophet ﷺ is in Bukhari and Muslim. I mean, if you bring everything, all the 14 books or whatever books, and you remove all the repetitions, right? You will realize that Bukhari and Muslim narrated the vast majority of the hadiths that we have. Is everything there correct? No. And every commentator on Bukhari and Muslim differed with them on some of the men or women, the narrators, some of the narrators, or some of the narrations. I showed you an example where Bukhari himself, radiallahu anhu, differed with Muslim, radiallahu anhu, on a narration and said, how can Muslim narrate that? It goes against the Quran. It doesn't mean that everything is not black and white, and you cannot really deal with the issues of hadith or seerah or any of that in a simplistic way. That is not scholarly. That is a major mistake. And I get really annoyed when people who don't have training in that, they go to Bukhari and Muslim and they narrate things and they correct and they discorrect. No, you have to get training. Every person could be a scholar, but they have to be trained to be a scholar, with a certificate, through a sheikh, through whatever it is. But you have to have some training in order to do that. It's not black and white. And if you have enough training in the book of Hadith and you read enough in the commentators, you will see that the commentators differ. With Bukhari and Muslim, it's not only somebody like me. I'm quoting other scholars anyway. But basically, they differed because they could not agree with some of the narrations. But Bukhari and Muslim's narrations are overwhelmingly correct. There is nothing, there is nothing in their character that is wrong or any of that.
So the last question, has Professor Auda written something on this topic with all the references which he can share, of which we can get online?
No, not on this topic particularly. I haven't written on this topic, but I have written on bits and pieces of that in some of my books. The ahadith related to women in Islam are there in my book that appeared last year or a year before. That's called Reclaiming the Mosque, the Role of Women in Islam, or Islam's House of Worship. So Reclaiming the Mosque. You will find links on that on my social media or my I'm not on social media, but on my website and the Maqasid Institute social media and so on. In Reclaiming the Mosque, I dealt with a number of narrations related to women in Islam. And I took a number of these stands that you saw in the slides on Aisha's age, radiallahu anha, on a number of issues that I dealt with in Reclaiming the Mosque. In Fiqh al-Maqasid, I have another book that's called Fiqh al-Maqasid, not in English, the Fiqh of Maqasid, in which I dealt with these hadiths of the bad omens and the hadith of Aisha. I have a paper actually that I wrote called Aisha's Amendments According to the Quranic Principles. You'll find it on up there on my website. I gave it once in a Triple IT America conference a few years back on Aisha's amendments particularly. So you will find these in my books, but I haven't written on the hadith particularly because I think that it's more important to focus on the methodology, on how we think and how we do research, which is what I'm focusing on these days.
May Allah reward us for sharing a wealth of knowledge with us as usual. May Allah honor you for honoring our invitation. Thank you everyone for attending.
We're done with all the questions. I can answer, inshallah. I don't mind. My next lecture is in 2 hours.
Unless you want to honor us with your time, we would appreciate it.
Yeah, I could take, I noticed a number of new questions. I could take 10 more minutes or 15. Inshallah.
Okay, we have another question.
For those who want to leave, they can leave.
Okay. Please. I'd like Professor to speak to this issue of trousers below the ankles and the famous hadith on it. It's something that bothers me a lot. Even though it may be a practical thing, what is his take on how we will pay, how we will pay the zakat al-fitr during this pandemic? Shukran.
Zakat al-fitr. Okay, the trousers, the hadith itself, I get really annoyed with that because the hadith itself, read the rest of it. When he sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, whoever has his thobe or his garment, sweeping the floor or on the floor is gonna be punished. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu told him, but I have it touching the floor. He told him, إِنَّكَ لَا تَفْعَلُوا خُيَلًا. You don't do this out of pride. The hadith is about Arabs at that time who used to have their garment very long. When a bride has a very, like her dress is very long and this and that. This kind of thing that we do now in ceremonies and so on. But they used to do that to show pride, to show arrogance, to show that I'm coming from this status and therefore I can afford 10 more meters of wool or 10 more meters of cotton at that time. So the Prophet ﷺ said, a believer should not do that. And if somebody does that, Allah will punish them. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu told him, okay, but I have my thobe touching the floor. He told him, no, you don't do this out of pride. So my brother, if you do it out of pride, if really, I don't know how we can make your trouser long out of pride. It's not really now something we do in our international culture. And as an Arab and now as a Canadian, if my trouser is touching the ground, it's just, I don't know, because it makes me warmer or something. It's not really arrogance or pride or any of that. So no, don't bother with this hadith. This is not an issue. If you go live in Arabia, it will be an issue because they are still doing these things. The prince or whatever will wear a garment that's really long, but this is not part. I visited Nigeria a couple times. This is not part of your culture in Nigeria. Don't worry about this. Inshallah.
I have a friend who is into painting. She has been heavily criticized and she's having a hard time dealing with the criticism. Is it permissible for Muslims to go into such careers?
Yes, it is. Art is not haram in Islam. Again, it's how we read the hadith in light of the Quran and in light of the other hadith. The same hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ told Aisha radiallahu anha that remove these paintings from the wall. Read the rest of the hadith, let alone the Quran, but read, the Quran is talking about statues and talking about other things, but read the rest of the hadith. He entered the home and he saw a picture that I had on the wall in the place where he used to pray. So when he prayed, he kept looking at it. So after the prayer, he pulled it down and he said, remove these things from me because they make me disorient or they affect my concentration. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Shagalatni. It made me busy while I'm praying to look at the drawings. And no, it's not haram. And the evidence is in the same hadith. What did she do with it? She took it and she made some pillows out of it. And or the other narration, she put it on the ground. So she used it in a pillow. So that painting on the wall, he Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was busy with it while praying, and that's why he took it down. It's nothing haram in Islam to paint or to draw or to make statues or any of that. But it is haram to complete the picture. It is haram to do that for something haram. Yani Allah forbid you're going to print somebody nude or photograph or a statue that calls for sin or something of that sort. Oh, of course, haram. But to print anything or to do, there is no evidence for that in the Hadith. And if you read the Hadith in its entirety and you put the Hadith together, and in light of what the Quran is talking about when it talks about such issues, you will see that this is not an issue. In fact, we have a great weakness doing art in Islam. We have a great weakness in this. Our movies are very simple, to be nice and to be polite, are very simple. Our nasheeds are very simple. Entertainment business had taken the next generation of Muslims by a lot of entertainment and drawings and this and graphics. And we barely have 1 or 2 games in the world that promote an Islamic value. Or all of these games for murder and killing and, God forbid, every sin. Our kids are playing with them, and we are, having a hard time, difficulty, trying to find, every game and what it is. It's because we haven't given enough attention to the issue of arts and graphics.
7,000.
Brother Idris, if you can turn off your phone, please. Thank you. Jazakallah. Please. Jazakallah khair.
How will we pay the Zakat al-Fitr during this pandemic? Shukran.
Zakat al-Fitr during the pandemic is, what do you mean? To give money that is equivalent to a meal. So that money could be paid. I mean, if you are in lockdown, do you have lockdown in Nigeria that's very strict? Or is it? Anyway, so if you are in lockdown, you can pay it online. There are so many places that take the Zakat al-Fitr donation online. See the amount of dollars or amount of currency that you would pay for a meal or something of an average meal. In the American Council and European Council, we have judged this to be about 10 American dollars. So in Nigeria might be different in other countries. So give this amount for yourself and every member of the family over the internet. And if you're talking about giving raisin and rice and so on, it doesn't have to be food. It could be money. People who insist on that are making something narrower than it should be. The Prophet ﷺ did not insist on the exact kind of cheese and what was that again in the hadith? The cheese and raisin and barley, and barley doesn't help the poor today, but money does. So give the zakatul fitr to the poor. And the Prophet ﷺ, again in the same hadith, said the point is to make them not ask anybody on that day. أغنوهم عن السؤال في ذلك اليوم. Give so that they don't have to ask. And if you can give more than the average meal, please do. If you're somebody rich and your average meal is not $2 or $3, it's actually $30 or $50 for your average meal, then do that. Then please give according to your average meal, so that they have at least one person gives one meal for a poor person for Eid, inshallah.
Having listened to you on some narrations which may not be quite true, how do I, as an ordinary Muslim, know how to identify if a hadith is right or wrong? Secondly, what is the place of common sense in all these?
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. It's common sense, but in Islam, we call it ask your heart. Ask your heart if this is right or wrong. But then, if you think it's not right, and you are not somebody who did Islamic scholarship enough to investigate, go ask a scholar. So if somebody tells you, no, you cannot paint anything, it's haram and so on, and you feel that this is not right, like why do I not paint? Why do I not take a camera? Some people still believe that cameras are haram and photography is haram. Why don't I take photography? If I am photographing somebody with their aura covered, and there is no problem. It's just there is nothing sinful here. If this, as the Prophet ﷺ says, if this touches your heart in the wrong way, if you feel that this is not right, what you call common sense, and the Prophet said it, called it, ask your heart, then go ask somebody. اسألوا أهل الذكر, ask the people of knowledge. If you are not capable, I don't advise you to get into the Hadith wars and Hadith out narrations, and this is complex and requires scholarship. Why did I bring this topic? I'm often asked to the public sometimes in a lecture like this, because I would like for the public to know that not anybody who comes with any narration tells you to do anything is correct. And this is becoming rampant, and this is wrong. So just to give you the defense mechanism, that go and read, go ask a scholar, and you will inshallah find the right answer, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. We've exhausted the questions.
Excellent, alhamdulillah.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy with it, alhamdulillah. And if there's anything, my brother Abdul Rashid has my email and my WhatsApp. Inshallah, you can connect with me. Inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah
khair. Thank you everyone for attending this session. We appreciate you honoring our invitation. Thank you, Professor Auda. May Allah reward and honor you. Thank you for always honoring our invitation. Please make a dua for us.
آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم. ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا وأخطأنا. ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا. ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا. أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. اللهم إنا نعوذ برضاك من سخطك ونعوذ بعفوك من عقوبتك ونعوذ بك منك لا نحصي ثناء عليك. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات. اللهم إنك عفو كريم تحب العفو فاعف عنا. اللهم إنك عفو كريم تحب العفو فاعف عنا. اللهم إنك عفو كريم تحب العفو فاعف عنا. وصلى اللهم على محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. جزاكم الله خير. بارك الله فيكم.
Ameen. Thank you very much once again.
MashaAllah.
Brother Rashid, do you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
Anybody else? Rashid.
Please join us next week as we have Dr. Basma Abdul Ghaffar again. She's going to be talking to us on Muslim civic participation, how Muslims can make a difference. Please stay safe, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you very much.
Taib. Jazakumullah khairan.
MashaAllah.
Thank you very much. Dr. Nuruddin Lemu here.
Oh, MashaAllah. Sheikh Nuru, how are you? Allah bless you. Allah bless you. It's such a pleasure to connect every week almost, mashallah. I was listening to you the other day in the Caribbean, subhanAllah, and we connect in different continents. Allah bless you. Allah bless you. We'll stay in touch, inshallah.
Inshallah. And thanks to our sister Basma. We look forward to hearing from
Allah bless you. I will convey salam. Salam to your wife and kids, and salam to Sister Maryam and family, inshallah.
Inshallah.
How's your father, by the way?
Inshallah. He's doing well. Weak, but alhamdulillah, under the circumstances.
Allah bless him. Allah bless his life. Please convey salam if he still remembers me, inshallah.
Inshallah. Inshallah. Thank you very much. Barakallah. Assalamu alaikum. Rashid Babalola.
Yes, Alaji Lemon, we'll talk offline.
Inshallah.
I'm going to call you and I'll give it to you. I'll retrieve and give it to you.
All right, inshallah.
Inshallah. All right.
Assalamu alaikum.
Malam Lemu, do not run away. Oh. The Sultanate of Lagos is greeting you. Salam alaikum.
Kabesio.
Yes.
I pay my respect.
Salam alaikum, my brother. How are you?
Hello. Is that Ghanaian? He looks like a guy.
Salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. How are you? The host has prevented me from using my video.
Okay.
Salam alaikum, Malam Nuru.
Oga Shamsu. Bao.
Alhamdulillah, I'm fine.
Sanu.
I sent you a WhatsApp message.
Okay, I'll have a look.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Yamzidin, you want here?
Emirewa, Suleiman, how you doing?
Alhamdulillah, how now?
We thank God we are fine.
How's everything?
Alhamdulillah. We are coping with COVID.
We don't have a
You are
choice.
coping with COVID very